started with a simple impulse. Evelyn had always been drawn to old things, things with a history, things that had seen more years than she ever would. The scent of aged paper, the rough texture of wood worn smooth by time, the whisper of forgotten stories clinging to objects no longer wanted. Antique stores were her sanctuaries, quiet places where she could lose herself among relics of the past. That day, the air inside the dimly lit shop was thick with dust and the scent of aged varnish. The bell above the door had barely finished its hollow chime when she spotted it. Propped against an old cabinet in the corner, hidden among the usual clutter, was a painting. The frame was heavy and ornate, its gold leaf darkened with time. The canvas within was cracked, the varnish yellowed, yet the image was striking. It was a portrait, oil on canvas, of a man dressed in black. His clothes hinted at another century, perhaps the late 1800s. A high-collared coat, the folds of a dark cravat. But it wasn't his attire that drew her in. It was his face. The man was pale, his skin almost waxen, stretched tightly over angular features. His cheekbones were sharp, his lips thin and colorless. But his eyes were what held her gaze. They were deep-set, almost too large for his face, and dark, not just in color but in essence. There was something unsettling about them, something that made her stomach twist in a way she couldn't quite define. She should have walked away. Instead, she asked the shopkeeper about the painting. The old man behind the counter glanced at it, then at her, a shadow of hesitation crossing his face, before he named a price that seemed too low for something so old. She didn't question it. She paid in cash, had it wrapped in brown paper, and carried it home herself. Her apartment was small but comfortable, filled with shelves of books and mismatched furniture. She cleared a space on the wall above the fireplace, hammering a nail into the plaster with careful precision. When she stepped back, hands on her hips, she studied the painting in its new home. The man in the portrait stared back at her. The light from the window cast shadows across the canvas, accentuating the hollows beneath his eyes, the sharp lines of his jaw. There was something almost too real about him, as if, given the right light, he might move. Evelyn shook off the thought and went about her evening. That night, the wind howled outside, rattling the glass of her bedroom window. She turned onto her side, pulling the blanket higher over her shoulder, and drifted into uneasy sleep. In the dark, the house settled, wood creaking softly as the temperature dropped. The painting remained on the wall. The man in black remained within it. His dark eyes remained open, watching. Over the next few days, the feeling of unease grew. It was subtle at first, just an odd sensation, like the weight of a gaze on the back of her neck as she moved through her apartment. She blamed it on the painting, on the way the man's dark eyes followed her no matter where she stood. It was a common effect in portraiture, she told herself, a trick of the artist's skill. But then, there were the smaller details, things she couldn't quite explain. The first time, she was sure she'd imagined it. She'd been drinking her morning coffee, staring absent-mindedly at the painting, when a thought crept into her mind. Had his posture always been so rigid? The high collar of his coat pressed against his jaw, the fabric stiff, his hands barely visible at his sides. She swore his shoulders had been slightly slumped before, as if weighed down by something unseen. She shook it off. A few days later, it happened again. She had just come back from work, exhausted, her mind foggy. She set down her keys, turned toward the fireplace, and froze. The man's head, just slightly, almost imperceptibly, was turned, It was such a small difference, so minor that she told herself she was imagining things. But she could feel it now, the unease pressing against the edges of her mind, like fingers curling around her skull. That night, she dreamed of dark eyes watching her from the corner of her bedroom. She started avoiding the painting. She refused to look directly at it when she walked past, keeping her gaze focused elsewhere. But she could feel it, always in her periphery, an unbearable presence in her own home. One evening she forced herself to confront it. It was just a painting after all, a piece of canvas and oil, nothing more. She grabbed a glass of wine, turned on the fireplace, and sat directly across from it, staring at the man's face, daring him to change, daring him to move. The flames flickered, their light dancing across the cracked surface of the painting. For a long time, nothing happened. And then, she didn't see it move. She just knew. The man's shoulders were angled differently now. His head turned slightly more in her direction, and his hands had shifted. Before, they had been obscured by the folds of his coat. Now, they were visible at his sides, fingers long and thin, as if slowly emerging from the shadows of the painting. A cold dread curled around her spine. She stood abruptly, heart pounding, and turned away. The wine glass trembled in her grip. She left the room, flipping the light switch off without looking back. That night, she locked her bedroom door. She didn't sleep. She convinced herself she was imagining it, that it was nothing more than a trick of the mind, fueled by stress and exhaustion. But deep down, she knew better. The man was moving. She considered taking the painting down, but the thought of touching it made her stomach churn. Instead, she draped a bedsheet over it. Out of sight, out of mind. It didn't help. The feeling of being watched only grew stronger. Even with the sheet covering the painting, she could sense it. At night, she swore she heard faint creaks in the floorboards, though she lived alone. Shadows seemed darker in the corners of her apartment. The air felt heavier. One evening, she found the bedsheet on the floor. Her breath hitched. She hadn't touched it. Her hands trembled as she picked it up, but she didn't dare put it back. Instead, she forced herself to look at the painting. She wished she hadn't. The man was closer now. His face, still the same waxen pallor, still the same hollowed cheeks, was unmistakably nearer. No longer confined to the center of the canvas, he had shifted slightly forward, his dark eyes staring out with something new, something almost eager. Her chest tightened. She had to get rid of it. Tomorrow, she would take it back to the shop, demand an explanation, do whatever it took to rid herself of the thing. Tomorrow. That night, the air in her apartment was unbearably still. The silence pressed in, thick and unnatural. She lay in bed, covers pulled up to her chin, staring at the locked door of her bedroom. She tried to sleep. She tried to ignore the sound of floorboards creaking outside her room, and the feeling that something was standing just beyond the door, watching, waiting. Evelyn woke with a start, her heart hammering. The apartment was silent except for the wind pressing against the windows, but something was wrong. The air felt heavier, charged with an oppressive stillness. She strained her ears, listening, barely breathing. The apartment was dark except for the faint glow of the street lamp outside. She glanced at the clock, 3:12 a.m. The feeling of unease coiled tightly in her chest. She reached for her phone, the glow of the screen momentarily casting eerie shadows against the walls. Nothing seemed out of place, yet the sensation of being watched was suffocating. She turned onto her side, her eyes flicking toward the bedroom door. It was still locked. She exhaled, forcing herself to close her eyes, to push away the creeping paranoia. It was just the stress of the past few days, the lack of sleep, the irrational fear festering in her mind. But as she drifted back into uneasy slumber, she could have sworn she heard it, the faintest sound, a whisper of movement. The next morning, Evelyn hesitated before stepping into the living room. She didn't want to see it. She didn't want confirmation that the man in the painting had moved again. But she had to look. The painting was still there, still mounted on the wall above the fireplace. She held her breath as her gaze locked onto the figure. He had moved again. He was closer. The shift was subtle but unmistakable. His body, once rigid in the center of the portrait, had leaned forward slightly. His face, oh God, his face, was more defined now. The hollow of his cheeks, the sharp angles of his jaw, the dark circles beneath his eyes. His hands were clearer too, emerging further from the shadows, fingers long and spindly. A shiver crawled up her spine. She needed to get rid of it. Without thinking, she grabbed the painting from the wall, yanking it down with shaking hands. The weight of it was heavier than expected, as if the frame itself resisted her touch. She carried it to the front door, throwing it open. Cold morning air rushed in, biting at her skin. She was going to throw it out. She had to, but her body wouldn't move. Something about the idea of leaving it out there, exposed, felt wrong, as if it wasn't meant to be discarded. A deep, inexplicable dread rooted her to the spot, her hands tightening around the frame. She couldn't do it. Instead, she shoved it into the hall closet, face down, burying it beneath coats and boxes. Out of sight, out of mind. Except, it wasn't. That night, the unease returned. The feeling of being watched was unbearable. She woke up multiple times, her skin clammy, her heart pounding. The darkness in the room felt deeper than before, pressing in, suffocating. In the silence, she thought she heard something. A slow, deliberate creak, like footsteps. Her breath caught in her throat. It was coming from the hallway, the closet. She squeezed her eyes shut, telling herself it was just her imagination. But she couldn't shake the feeling that something was standing just beyond the bedroom door, waiting. The next morning, she avoided the closet entirely. She left for work without even glancing in its direction. But the thought of it festered in the back of her mind all day. The knowledge that the painting was still there, that the man was still inside. When she returned that evening, the apartment felt different, colder. She set down her keys and froze. The closet door was open. A sharp, sickening fear curled in her gut. She hadn't opened it. She was sure of that. Yet the door was ajar, the coats slightly shifted, and the painting, it was no longer face down. It was propped against the back wall of the closet, standing upright, and the man inside had moved again. She staggered backward, her breath coming in short, shallow gasps. His face was clearer than ever, as if the layers of time had peeled away, sharpening his features. His lips, once barely visible, now curled at the corners. A smile. It was the first time she had seen his teeth. She slammed the closet door shut and locked it. Her hands trembled as she backed away. This was impossible. She needed to get rid of it. That night, she barely slept. Every sound made her flinch. Every shadow seemed deeper than before. She kept the lights on, refusing to let the darkness creep in. She told herself she would take the painting back to the shop in the morning, demand an explanation, do whatever it took to be free of it. But morning came, and something changed. She awoke to a new sensation, an absence. The suffocating feeling of being watched was gone. The weight pressing on her chest had lifted. For the first time in days, she felt normal. It was over. A wave of relief washed over her as she got out of bed. Maybe she had imagined it all. Maybe the lack of sleep had made her see things, made her mind twist shadows into something sinister. She stepped into the living room, stretching her arms, exhaling a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. And then she saw it. The painting was back on the wall, exactly where it had been before. Her blood turned to ice. This couldn't be happening. She had put it in the closet. She had locked the door. Yet there it was, hanging above the fireplace. And the man, he was even closer. His face filled more of the canvas now, as if he had stepped forward within the frame. His eyes, once merely dark, were now cavernous, endless voids. And his smile had widened. Her breath came in ragged gasps. She ran to the kitchen, grabbing a knife, her mind screaming at her to destroy it, to tear it apart. But as she turned back, something stopped her. She swore, for the briefest moment. She saw movement, not in the room, within the painting. His fingers, thin, impossibly long, had shifted. She dropped the knife. A choked sob escaped her lips. She couldn't stay here. Grabbing her coat and keys, she fled the apartment, not daring to look back. Outside, the air was sharp with cold, but it felt safer than the space she had just escaped. She paced to the sidewalk, trying to steady her breathing. She needed help. Someone. Anyone. She reached for her phone, her fingers numb, ready to call a friend. And then she stopped. In the reflection of the apartment window, she could see inside. The painting faced the glass, and the man was no longer alone. A shadow loomed beside him. Someone else, standing just behind him, watching, waiting. Evelyn stood frozen on the sidewalk, her breath clouding in the cold night air. Her reflection in the window trembled, but her eyes remained locked on the painting inside. The man in the portrait was no longer alone. There was another figure, indistinct, shadowy, standing just behind him. The air around her felt wrong, thick with something unseen, pressing against her skin like unseen hands. She backed away from the window, heart hammering, her pulse loud in her ears. She needed to leave, to go somewhere, anywhere, away from that apartment, away from that thing on the wall. She turned and started walking, her legs unsteady beneath her. The street was empty, the distant hum of the city muted, as if the world itself had fallen away, leaving only her and the suffocating presence that clung to her like smoke. She didn't stop until she reached a small motel on the edge of town. The flickering neon sign cast a sickly red glow over the cracked pavement. She paid for a room in cash, avoiding the bored clerk's gaze as she took the key. The door creaked as she stepped inside, locking it behind her. Only then did she let herself breathe. She sat on the bed, pressing her palms against her eyes. Exhaustion clawed at her, but sleep refused to come. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw them, the man in the painting, the figure behind him, the shifting, growing darkness that had swallowed her apartment whole. She had to do something, destroy it. The thought jolted through her like a live wire. She should have done it the moment she noticed him move. She should have burned it, ripped it apart, anything but let it fester inside her home like a parasite. Morning couldn't come fast enough. By the time the first weak light of dawn crept through the motel's dusty blinds, she had made up her mind. She would go back. She would end this. The walk back to her apartment felt like a march toward something inevitable. The streets seemed quieter than usual, as if the city itself held its breath. She reached her building, hesitating at the entrance. The door loomed before her, the weight of what lay beyond it pressing against her chest. She swallowed the fear rising in her throat and stepped inside. Everything looked the same hallway, the same worn carpet beneath her feet, the same door at the end leading to her apartment. She reached out, her fingers brushing against the doorknob. It was cold, too cold. She turned it slowly, pushing the door open. The apartment was silent. She stepped inside, her pulse thudding in her ears. Nothing seemed out of place. The furniture sat in its usual arrangement. The curtains swayed slightly in the draft. And then her gaze fell on the fireplace. The painting was still there, but the man was gone. Her breath hitched. The canvas was empty. The ornate frame still hung in place. The background of the portrait still painted in muted browns and blacks. But the figure that had haunted her, watched her, moved within the painting, was gone. A low, creeping dread curled in her stomach. The apartment felt occupied, not empty, not abandoned. Something lingered in the air, thick and cloying, brushing against her skin like breath against the back of her neck. She took a step back. The floor creaked behind her. Her body went rigid. The sound had come from inside the room. She wasn't alone. A whisper of movement, the faintest rustle of fabric. Her breath came in short, shallow gasps as she forced herself to turn. He was there, standing in the doorway to her bedroom. The man from the painting, no longer confined to the canvas, no longer oil and pigment, but flesh and bone and shadow. He was impossibly tall, his limbs elongated, his fingers curling into the dim light like creeping tendrils. His face, pale, sharp, hollowed, was twisted into something that resembled a grin, and his eyes, dark, bottomless, hungry. Evelyn stumbled backward, her legs barely obeying her as she scrambled away. But he moved too, slow, deliberate, each step impossibly silent, as if the weight of the world did not apply to him. Her back hit the wall. No escape. His hand reached out, long skeletal fingers stretching toward her, the air turning icy in their wake. She opened her mouth to scream, and the lights flickered. For a fraction of a second, the world stuttered. A sound, low, guttural, something ancient, rumbled through the room. The lights blinked again, and he was gone. The air around her shattered, the heaviness lifting in an instant. She gasped, clutching at her chest, her entire body trembling. She turned wildly, expecting to see him lurking in the corners behind the furniture, waiting in the dark. But he was nowhere. And then she saw it, the painting. Her stomach lurched. He was back inside, but it wasn't the same. He was closer, no longer standing in the background, no longer a passive observer within the canvas. His face filled nearly the entire frame, and this time, his lips were parted, as if whispering something, as if laughing, or waiting for the next time the lights went out